On the other side, the players welcomed into the throes of the city with a song that literally sounds like it was composed of various city sounds. There's a cool, almost bossa nova sound to it. It's very worldly. Bossa nova itself originates from South America, and its pseudo-inclusion here makes sense, as big cities, such as the one we're about to enter, are often affiliated with the idea of hodgepodges of different cultures. And seeing as this one is clearly modeled off of New York City, this isn't a big stretch to suggest, as the Big Apple is emblematic of much of this concept, being the home of Ellis Island, once the biggest immigrant inspection and processing station in the United States, vetting more than 12 million immigrants into the country. So this cultural, worldly feel contributes to not only evoking the feeling of the big city, but also lends to the sheer scale of it, since, as we'll see, this place is huge. Welcome to Fourside, the largest city in Eagleland. This place is gigantic, and streets intersect all over, making it feel both large and also confusing for many first-time players, though I'd argue this further enhances the atmosphere of being lost in a metropolis. The pronounced greens in the trees and grass surrounding the city really bleed into the setting's identity, which elicits imagery of the Emerald City from The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum, and even more so of the 1939 film adaptation directed by Victor Fleming. Up to this point, the two story structures have been incredibly similar, following a protagonist making their way across a country, netting friends along the way. They even both follow roads. This isn't surprising either, as both follow the archetypal hero journeys mode of storytelling, so it all checks out, but nonetheless, the cities in particular have staggering similarities, more of which we'll cover later. With no direct path, the game leads the player through the city, intentionally may I add, as, again, to capture the feeling of exploring one. I'm opting to choose a clockwise spiral-like path in order to cover it as efficiently as possible. This man in blue talks about how the city, Fourside, has been growing since a Mr. Geldegard Monotoli hit the big time, and that it's been good for the city. This is very interesting for many reasons, as we'll come back to this in a little bit, just remember it for now. Next is the Monotoli Grand Hotel. A night here is $75 per person, so for now, $225. With inflation, today that comes to just over $465 USD. That's the city for you. The people of Fourside are pretty flippant with their talk of money. It's pervasive. This blonde man is quite funny, by the way. Before we head to our next stop, let's cover the enemies here really quick. First, there's the extra cranky lady, an upgraded version of the bag ladies from before, which appropriately have a chance of dropping a handbag strap. There's also the Mad Taxi, which is the perfect car to make into an enemy in a city, especially with how common and aggressive drivers of such vehicles can be, not to mention their association with a psychotic nature due to the Scorsese film of the same name. The background for their battles is also very loud and flashy, sort of like traffic lights. They can drop exterminator spray, which I think is a joke about finding bugs in a cab, which is humorous. There's the crazed sign, which is hilarious in execution. Supposedly crazed, it has a very uninterested look in its eyes, with a speed limit of 40. With a name like Crazed Sign, one would expect some outrageous speed limit, but instead it's arguably the most median of them all. Seen as if one hypothetically wanted to be as safe as possible when they didn't know the speed limit, in most places 40 miles per hour would be the safest one to choose, as if the speed limit was 35, they'd only be 5 over, and if it was 45, they'd only be 5 under. Those 5 miles per hour in most jurisdictions being considered an acceptable dissonance by law enforcement. The sign also clearly says Ohio on it, which is interesting, because this seems to suggest canonically Eagleland is made up of the same states as its real-world counterpart, or is made up of them along with some additional ones. The contrast is what drives the humor here, is what I'm saying. It can also drop a big bottle rocket, which further contrasts its malaised appearance. And the final enemy is the annoying reveler, who often wastes turns complaining. The insinuation being he's drunk, especially considering he can drop a protein drink, which comes across like a pretty thinly veiled joke. Our next stop around the corner is this pink building with a sign. The sign reads, "Planning meeting for EarthBound 2. Only those who are related to this project are allowed to enter. Ape Software Development Team." Funny, especially in hindsight. Its placement here also checks out. Very aside, as I don't want to get into constantly bringing up the player's guide to the game's official strategy guide that came with every copy in the United States, but really quickly, it's mentioned Fourside's nickname is the Big Banana, clearly playing on New York's nickname the Big Apple, but also works as a place for a big ape to live, maybe even one that climbs iconic landmarks. Up next is the cafe. Inside there's a jukebox, which is just a decoration, seemingly implying this place is meant to be a sort of throwback to 1950s cafes. The music in here is very weird. It has a distorted version of the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem of the United States, overlaid with a sample of the theme from the early 1900s short film series Our Gang, later known as The Little Rascals, playing, which is another thing we'll revisit later. Anyway, the vibe is off in here. This man, who is clearly drinking, claims to be in the middle of a caffeine buzz, though this is clearly a guise, with him admitting to having experienced what he concedes may have been a hallucination. Alcohol typically only invokes auditory hallucinations via what's called alcoholic hallucinosis, a rare complication from chronic alcohol abuse, of which fits with his account of hearing something in a wall. This guy is totally ordinary and somehow likes the atmosphere here, but he also has a quiz. What is 5 minus 1? A regular Magnus Carlsen over here. He then says, Master Pokey's maid Electra is made to order, revealing Pokey seems to be up to something somewhere in the city. The mustachioed man used to be Monotoli's employer and realized Monotoli's schemes bankrupted him, causing him to lose everything. Further commenting, Monotoli's rise has been fast and sharp, and he's always waiting to see if he comes here. The lady at the end of the bar says kids shouldn't be drinking espresso. It'll stunt your growth. Just kidding, that was a myth. She says Monotoli isn't here. The bartender with the eye patch also denies all possibility of Monotoli ever coming here. You know, something someone would say if he never came here. The purple walls also give off a shady atmosphere, something akin to a bar in a noir. At the northmost point of the city, there's this guy, clearly drinking in broad daylight. He claims Monotoli stole everything from him. He says they are evil incarnate. Lawyers, police, and anyone else following Monotoli, implying he's paid them off. He feels defeated, crying into his cappuccino. He moonwalks away. While Happy Happy Village dealt with religious oppression, Threed with the malaise of the average worker, and Saturn Valley with the forced worker, Fourside explores evil through the lens of the political and corporate elite, and in a different way from how it somewhat did with Master Belch. This branch of the story takes a turn into the political thriller genre, a rabbit hole we'll now be delving further into. Passing the hospital, the players will encounter the man with a can. He says he's very punctual and careful with money, as you can see. Down the street is this arms dealer who has a punk look going, which works with the big city theming and the gangs that are active in many of the state's most notable ones. He notably sells broken items, and this adds a dash of environmental storytelling, as it almost comes across like this city hooligan is attempting to scam those he can tell are from the suburbs, giving him a city edge. He also has a distinctly English dialect when leaving his shop, mod boys, coming from the slang of England back in the early 60s. The modernists were an aspirational subculture of young men and women who dressed smarty and beautifully as a statement of rebellion against the austerity of their parents' generation, prior to what would go on to become the swingin' 60s. These mods would end up being the template for what would eventually become what's essentially the modern teenager. Basically, he's calling you a bunch of normies. As for why he does so here escapes me. It's only here and pretty out of nowhere, though again, this place is clearly identified as Eagleland's New York, home to millions of immigrants from all over. Just south is a wall that has some strange structure on the other side, along with a present and a sewer entrance. This guy looking over the wall comments on its strangeness, saying it's not his place, but possibly the protagonist's. Subtle. Note to self, search for a sewer entrance. This guy makes a joke that definitely implies he thinks something else is on the other side. Nearby is the Monotoli building, but we'll search that out later. Next door is the department store, which is temporarily closed. Gwarg. Not subtle, but indicates the player to come back here later, and that there's something strange afoot at the Fourside department store. This nearby man elaborates on such, that strange things have started happening there once Monotoli rose to power. Definitely important. This also lets the player know that this place will be important in the near future, as its importance has been clarified to be directly tied to this Monotoli arc of the story. South of there is a policeman who shows that Monotoli very much does have the police in his pocket, in case there was any doubt as to the origins of what the other man said. The particularly anti-corporate, anti-capitalist themes emerge quite clearly here. This is quite a long explanation I don't really want to get deeply into, but the general concept of there being an elitist capitalist class at odds with the working proletariat class is straight out of the works of Karl Marx. Would posit that the police forces are not seen as neutral protectors of all citizens, but as tools to defend the property and wealth of the bourgeois, defenders of the status quo. This section of the game is definitely the apex of this underlying theme, but I am definitely not well versed enough in the theory to analyze it much deeper than this, though there'll be a couple other points I'll connect to it. And for all intents and purposes, this is about as much as one would need to know to get the general idea of at least some of what this section is trying to say. Such is highlighted by him outright saying protecting the people of the city, the proletariat, explicitly comes second to protecting Monotoli, whose name is blatantly a parody of Mr. Monopoly, the mascot for the board game franchise, which was initially created in 1903 by American monopolist Lizzie Maggi, originally the landlord's game, to be a tool to explain the issues with concentrating land in private monopolies. Monopolies being the symbolic set piece in EarthBound for the broad stroke idea of capitalism. This is underscored by his saying that doing so is their job. This also harkens back to the corrupt police force of O-Net, and its juxtaposition to the same happenings taking place in the big city. Contrasting the small town of O-Net is an intentional one, putting forward that there's a separate flaw in the police system that Gygas is possibly taking advantage of by influence over likely Monotoli, though this also clearly implies that such happening with the police are still ultimately in the hands of those in power, whether it be utilized for good or exploited for evil. Around the corner is the Fourside Bakery, which has 2 floors. Inside, there's a woman who bemoans the city's bread has a nondescript flavor to it, then revealing herself to be the owner, which is hilarious when you then see how overpriced their bread-based options are. Upstairs is a man resembling Mr. T. He seems to have an apartment above the bakery, not untypical of cities to have above stores. He says he was just thinking that there's a tightwad born every minute, a play on the quote attributed to ringleader P.T. Barnum, "There's a sucker born every minute." Ironically, he himself seems to be both the sucker and the tightwad here, as he's the one the sign in the desert points to as being the one who lost his grandma's contact lenses. Using the item on him, he greatly thanks the protagonists and gives them his socks he only uses for special occasions, that he's worn for over 5 years. You shouldn't have. Really. This item can be used one time in battle to immobilize an enemy with their ripe odor. This is the only proper side quest by traditional meanings in the game, in a genre known for having extensive amounts of them. This comes across to me as a play on the trope in JRPGs of most side quests being a simple get the thing mission, often called fetch quests, in return for an insignificant item, not to be confused with the insignificant item. Often such requests feel disproportionate to the time spent completing them. So, by virtue that the protagonist literally found contact lenses in an entire desert, then trudged all the way to the city to give them to a character who gives no such indication he's even the right guy, in return for a pair of disgusting socks, definitely seems to be a direct parody of this convention. The man with a saxophone, likely implied to be a street performer, explains Monotoli was previously a subpar real estate agent who now runs the city, giving some nice backstory to this character. This guy nearby asks about the guys digging for gold in the desert, saying whatever they find will be worth the big bucks that could easily pay off $1 million debt. He's notably placed outside the Topola Theater, which is absolutely intentional for reasons we'll see in a bit. Speaking of, the theater is right next to him, which is another building we'll get to later. Wrapping around, the man in the fedora reveals that the Runaway Five are putting on a successful show at the Topola Theater. Now, the talk of debt is starting to make more sense, isn't it? That brings us back to the start, so let's pass go and do a lap around the inner block of the city now. This guy, intentionally in the I Heart NY shirt, implying New York also exists in England, says there's a new singer at the Topola Theater named Venus, who's supposedly quite striking. This woman in blue says she's heard bad things about Monotoli. Shocker. She says he supposedly made a deal with a purely evil entity in exchange for power. Wonder who that could be. Really though, this does raise some questions. Does this imply Gygas can transcend mere influence and can outright communicate, or even possibly physically meet with people? Is Gygas more than just some sort of demonic force, apparently able to engage with what sounds like the buying and selling of people's souls? Is this even Gygas? The rabbit hole goes deeper. Just over, between all these buildings, is the Hint Man, with a big sign displaying as such. This greaser guy on the grass says someone who looks just like Monotoli has been hanging out at Jackie's cafe. Apparently this guy's Jackie. Seems those people there are even shiftier than they already seemed. But what would Monotoli want with a small neglected cafe? Whatever it is, going off what this guy says, it's apparently a quick dealing. Here there's also a sign advertising a junk shop called Busted Up in the back of the department store. Noted. On the other side of the Monotoli building is an officer literally protecting it, standing guard out front like security. He questions the protagonist's motives for snooping around Monotoli's business, saying if he catches the boys, he'll arrest them. He even outright says the main boy's name, sort of a pattern disruptor, as the main character's name has been pretty sparsely used outside very unambiguous story scenes. This is among the only NPCs outside of them that do this. It really does help solidify the feeling that they're watching you. He even draws attention to it. It's a very Hitchcockian detail, and might be the inspiration for the sunglasses they all wear. It also lends to their suspicious image, obscuring where their eyes are looking, contrasting the second boys who have a level of honesty doled into their design, as his pupils are always visible. At the very center of Fourside is the Dinosaur Museum, visually signifying it's important. Attempting to enter without paying triggers a short dialogue with the desk lady, who demands it. Nice detail, also continues to lend to Fourside's emphasis on money. After taking a quick picture, the player might read the plaque in front of the giant dinosaur skeleton. It details they're believed to be from a southern region of a place called Scaraba, and to avoid probing further. Even the museum has shady business going on. This old guy says he'd like to see a dinosaur sometime in his life, and at his age, I say good luck with that. This is also hinting towards something much later. This girl has a humorous line, and this I Heart NY fella suggests the museum sell t-shirts, implying he's a tourist. On the far left, a man named Mr. Spoon, who introduces himself as the academic researcher, is happy to see so many visitors at the museum, keeping an eye out for celebrities. He furthers the rumors about the dinosaur bones' origins, suggesting that there might even be living ones, asking the player to let him know if this is the case. Maybe someday. This setup might be alluding to the travels of Marco Polo, autobiographical logs by the explorer Marco Polo, run throughout his travels in the 13th and 14th centuries. These included extensive journals on his findings during his time in Asia, and particularly China, famously reporting on the existence of dragons. Many researchers have come to believe since that he had misidentified several reptiles. One he reported on was a giant serpent with a large head, which has been suggested to have possibly actually been a crocodile. This specific expert comes from Chapter 40. Here are seen huge serpents, 10 paces in length, and 10 spans in the girt of the body. At the forepart, near the head, they have 2 short legs, having 3 claws like those of a tiger, with eyes larger than a 4-penny loaf, pane quattro denari, and very glaring. The jaws are wide enough to swallow a man, the teeth are large and sharp, and their whole appearance is so formidable that neither a man nor any kind of animal can approach them without terror. Anyway, with this building's very central location in Fourside, we'll probably find ourselves here again at some point. Maybe after we find out about these dinosaur goings-ons. The woman at the front desk says the bones are replicas, but she might be kept on the outside of things, as she's conflicting with the academic. Back outside, it's time to finally observe the Monotoli building. Coming back to the Wizard of Oz illusions, the building's also pseudo-central placement gives it a mythological stature, emphasized by its immense height, much like the home of the wizard. Inside, the building looks a lot like a real-world office building, and everyone's in suits. There's also foreboding music. Lets the player know something's off here. This guy implies he was playing strip solitaire, which is absurd and funny, but also a play at the high-rolling lives of people on Wall Street, as he was very likely gambling. This guy is pretty straightforward about who he is. Inside the elevator, the operator informs the protagonist it's only for Master Pokey's use, going directly to the 47th floor, letting them know he's here. She then says for him to stop staring at her hips, also asking why he doesn't stand somewhere that isn't right behind her. So this is meant to insinuate the main character is staring at her butt, more or less. Again, there's this slightly perverted edge to the boy that isn't shown in many pubescent characters, and is the second instance of such a thing happening. Again, it plays into the age the boy is, but also gives the player insight into that there's a mischievous, debatably evil side to themselves as well. Arriving on the 47th floor, there are 2 security workers, one asking if you're friends with Pokey, also suggesting if you go to the wrong place here, you'll be shot. That's a city for you. And this one, who almost accidentally beats the protagonists up. Is he possibly the one that Jewed you? Seeing as these 2 clearly work for Monotoli, this extends the branch of those controlled by the corporate elite. There's a private elevator nearby, but the player can't use it as of now. Through this door into the next room, the player is brought into a shimmering gold penthouse, with music meant to almost taunt the player, because who's here other than Pokey? Seriously, that music is like an oral rendition of someone who's sticking their tongue out at you. Pokey expectedly acts all high and mighty because, well, he sort of is. Like with the hotel manager in Happy Happy Village, it's a way to invoke an engagement of frustration in the player that they can't do anything about it, and the injustice of someone as conceited as Pokey pokes at their inherent understanding of justice. He's immature in name calls before revealing he's Monotoli's partner, No doubt Gygas made this part of Monotoli's deal with him. With this revelation, he has his security escort the party out. Before leaving though, I have to comment on how fitting it is to have someone as conceited and self-absorbed as Pokey have a private floor that is so tacky as to be entirely gold. I also appreciate Pokey's pinstripe suit, which clearly evokes the imagery of old school gangsters, which fits right in with the corruption angle and city theming. The room next door to Pokey's is also solid gold, where the player can see Aloysius Minch as well. He reveals with Pokey's new influx of power, he's coming along for the ride to also live the high life. It goes to show how even now the focus isn't on his son, who's permitting this lifestyle for him, but just about having the experience for himself. There's still a literal wall between the two, showing they're still very much separate. For all we know, Pokey may have had his bodyguards keep his father away from him, having been troubled by all the pain from before. He doesn't even mention him when he's discussing his current plans in life. All that said, there's not much else to do here for now. Back outside, there's one more place to scope out, the Tupola Theater. The theater's name is a clear mock of the Apollo Theater in New York. To get in, the player needs to buy a ticket and show it to the ticket taker, similar to the Chaos Theater back in Tucson. Through the doors, the player is welcomed into a much larger theater than that one though, again putting the scale of things at the forefront of the atmosphere. The player can talk to the NPCs in here, but they don't have much to say. On the opposite end, the worker in front of this door says the Runaway Five asked specifically for the protagonist to be let in, which he does. In the literal green room, the player is reunited with the band, who have once again fallen into severe debt. They do still have some funny lines though. The saxophone player says he has a hunch they'll need to help them to get to Monotoli. Nudge nudge, wink wink. Leaving the room, the player is treated to a viewing of the Runaway Five's new Big City show. The member who usually wears green hair in several versions displays incorrectly as black. Not sure why, though it may be intending on showing how he takes his performing in the renowned venue more seriously than his counterpart co-frontman. In the other room through the lobby, the player meets the venue manager, who reveals they're $1 million in debt. She jokes the player would have to find buried gold to pay off the sum. Now it probably seems really on the nose to some, as there have been a few instances of explicitly clear directions that the gold miners in the desert are going to play a role here, but I think this is at least a little bit necessary. I mean, Fourside is huge, so having many places players can get concise direction is helpful, especially since many players won't bother talking to everyone like I am, despite the game's insistence that they do. Well, back to the desert. Now it's quite a walk there, not too bad, but not exactly minor either. Luckily the player can take the bus for $6, and even cheaper if they do so with some of their party members unconscious, but it's a catch-22, with the bus taking them all the way to the far side of the desert, still far off from the gold mines. Again, it's not atrocious how long it takes to walk there, but there could have been something to mediate the travel here, especially as revival items can be quite expensive still, and there's no hospital out here, so reviving a party member here requires the player to walk then all the way back to Fourside if that happens. So I'm going to try to avoid that. Back at the mining site, a large group has gathered, as Montague has made lots of progress. There's a vendor who sells some helpful stuff, including a skip sandwich and a picnic lunch. Maybe we should try to remember that. There's also a healer who won't revive anyone, but it's nice to have. In the mines, Gerardo explains while digging he found a maze. He says the monsters are halting progress and that there are 5 big moles. Mission clear. The mines are home to quite a few enemies, such as the Noose Man, not only one of the greatest character designs ever, but also quite shocking even now. There are also the Mad Ducks. Now, they're both enemies that will inconvenience the player, but I can't really make out why these enemies are placed here specifically. I don't really get how they connect to the setting. The closest I can come to with the Noose Men are that they were used a lot in the Old West, so maybe they're supposed to suggest they're from then?
First time.
Seems like a stretch. And the ducks, I can't make any sense of. Don't really fit into either with the desert or underground, especially since the gigantic ant enemies, which are clearly mutated versions of the Titanic ant, and thirsty coil snakes fit right in with both aspects of the location. Anyway, this place is indeed a bit of a maze. It's not too bad, but it can be confusing, and it branches off on many pathways, so I can't exactly lay out how it leads the player along through, as it does seem the intention is to somewhat confuse them. There are items and exit mice available though, so the game isn't all out cruel, but it can definitely be a challenge to newcomers. Each major path though terminates in a mini boss fight against a giant mole, all of whom believe they are the 3rd strongest of the 5. Fittingly, moles aren't a surprise to see in a desert, and in fact are always guaranteed to be the first enemy the player will encounter in the desert. Overall though, the real test here seems to be the PP management, and we all know how the main character is with that. The player has to heal everyone and restore HP if they're low on items. have both PSI users use their magic on the moles since they have power shields, and try and save it the best they can for those battles. It can be tough, and thoughtfully there is a free place to heal just outside the mines, so that in conjunction with the exit mice makes this not too bad. Unless someone dies. It's a nice focused challenge, even if it teeters on annoying. And again, there's the exit mice who are central to the dungeon, offering an easy emergency exit if needed. And after the final Guardian Digger is defeated, all the other enemies kindly vanish, so the player can leave in peace, almost like taking a victory lap. The music changing also communicates that the objective has been cleared. It's a photo finish. Talking to Montague after, he'll be happy to see that the monsters have been cleared out and get back to digging. All that done, there's nothing left to do but wait. The player's left a bit directionless here, but it is made clear that the objective to help the Runaway 5 is to complete these things with the gold mines, so a player then returning to Fourside despite not having anything to show for it isn't the strangest choice of action, especially seeing as there's certainly nothing to do in Threed. Crossing the bridge back, the player will be stopped by George Montague, who says they found a diamond while mining and gives it to them as a reward for helping him out earlier. An interesting thing about this cutscene is if the player is riding a bus, it still happens, which is thoughtful as the player accidentally skipping past it would leave them at a loss for what to do. Back at the Topola, which you would have to pay to get back into, yeah, the city, the player revisits the manager, just as they did in Tucson. There's a strange parallel between saving the band and giant moles being part of the path to doing so. I don't have a strong abstraction from this, but it might be a correlation between the blindness moles are known for and the Runaway 5's blindness or negligence of their blatant, unclean, irresponsible lifestyles. Maybe something about unclean lifestyles perpetuating a stunting of maturity. Anyway, the player has to do that thing again where they show the manager the item of interest from behind their desk. Again, probably to keep the path clear for when the band enters, but they couldn't just make the characters move automatically. She plays coy and takes it, releasing the band from their contracts. They do their song and dance before being joined by Venus, the singer, on stage, and then by their car. Bombastic, and true to the feeling of the Blues Brothers. There's a couple of funny NPCs clearly going through relationship troubles in the lobby, and with that, business is finished at the Topola Theater. This completed, many NPCs' dialogue changes, and seeing as many players' first instinct would be to talk to people to find the next objective, the NPC directly outside the theater gives clear direction, telling the protagonist that the department store is reopened. Inside the store, this mouse foreshadows, suspecting something will happen. Call it a sixth sense. There's a back room that has an arms dealer, as mentioned before, who sells big bottle rockets. Very helpful. When attempting to leave, an alien will speed by, kidnapping the female protagonist. He then comes over the PA, telling the player to come to the office on the 4th floor, ending with the same sound the sign from before had. If the player isn't prepared, the enemies in certain combinations can be extremely tough and hard-hitting. It's pretty unforgiving for having just taken away one of the party's most useful members, and dying here can lead to a tough cycle of then being on one's own, dying to something else, then constantly having to revive and heal all around the city, draining their wallet. Just how tough this section is tends to be the luck of the draw. Many enemies here are unavoidable, as they'll wait at the tops of escalators. Not to mention they'll likely catch new players off guard at first as they look like presents. The theming is fun though, as all the musical instruments and coffee do invoke the feeling of a mall, so that balances it out, right? The trek up does well at building tension, as by the time the player is stopped a final time in front of the door does generate some feelings of anxiety, as the road here has been tough enough and they can likely see a boss or mini-boss is coming. The player enters to see the alien monster behind the desk. The implication it runs the department store also subtly forwards the anti-corporate themes this arc of the story has had. He makes a sly comment to step around saying the player will burn in hell, which does raise a question about even aliens in this universe seeming to understand some sort of cosmic religious truth. Just sort of strange from a world-building point of view. The battle itself kicks off a very bizarre section of the game, ushered in by the flannel background, which when distorted has a sort of time warp look to it. The fight isn't too tough, but can be tricky if a player has bad luck, as on a first playthrough they may not expect an alien to wield pretty strong magic attacks, as this is the first time they face one that isn't robotic in nature. This mall section is a tough rope to walk though, as the designers left open a potential outcome where the main character can unintentionally gain a massive lead on the experience of the blonde boy multiple times. As the alien swears his vengeance, he reveals the female protagonist to be in Monotoli's proximity now, and then the lights come back on. The game does seem to implicate that there was some sort of reality-bending act during the power outage, as several NPCs acknowledge it but suggest they didn't see any of the monsters and didn't even leave during it. This lends to the strange mini-arc we're about to venture on. Also, this mouse is just a tool now. Leaving the store, the player's first inclination would probably be to go to the Monotoli building, but this isn't the case as they still can't use the private elevator, which is the clear path forward there. At a loss, the NPCs say much of the same, noticeably this one who still talks about Jackie's Cafe. It's not perfect, but I still think this is an ample direction, as no other story threads with other characters in the city have emerged aside from Monotoli and the Runaway 5, one of which is completed, and even then the hint man still points the player there. Back at the cafe, the only NPC's dialogue who changes is this woman's, who the player needs to talk to progress the story. Now, it probably sounds like this transitional segment in the game is poorly done, but most players probably didn't go into every single building on their first visit, so there are plenty whose first visit here would be now. And players also shouldn't be so stubborn as to assume just because there wasn't something to do somewhere an hour ago means that there will never be, especially as the game has ran them through a process of elimination to get here. The lady says she hears a commotion outside, suggesting it's spectators at a baseball game singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" at the stadium. I really wish she would have just said she heard something outside, for as big as Fourside is, there is no baseball stadium, which is annoying as this contradiction could have been so easily avoided. Going back outside, the player will encounter none other than Everdred, collapsed in an alleyway. The onlookers are chattering about if he's dead or drunk in a roundabout way, which can be argued is a bit contradictory to the setting, as stereotypically city folk tend to be very blunt in their wording, but it does get the point across, so I don't think this is much of an issue. The man on the right says he'll let the party go past him in exchange for an item. Now, in all honesty, I cannot understand why the game feels the need to do this, as the player doesn't receive a key item or anything in the immediate future, and hasn't hesitated telling the player to clear their pockets then and there before, so I think it's just a way of showing this guy is greedy, and no, despite his appearance, he's not this guy from before, who can still be seen at this moment at his usual spot. Doing this even triggers pretty distinct serious text, but I do not understand why, for what gameplay purpose. The game does do a good job of drawing the player here, as aside from the massive visual flag, the music also switches to a much simpler track, making it feel like everything in the city is froze, to emphasize the serious moment. Talking to Everdred, he tells the player Carpainter was hiding something, and he attempted to steal then sell it. That being something called Manny Manny, a strange colored doll thing. He reveals Monotoli duped him and stole it, revealing the statue from before itself is the source of much of Gygas's evil influence, and it's somewhere in the city, continuing its silent narrative from Onett to Tucson to here. He concludes by saying to check behind the counter in the cafe, then recites a haiku, a type of poem that originates from Japan. These poems are often affiliated with a sort of gentle connotation, and it, along with the scene and overall mood, casts a pretty dark shadow on this moment. He says he must be on his way, and then gets up and walks away. He shoves some bystanders, and then the scene ends, and the music cues back in. Now, this is clearly a bait and switch, as the tone suggests he's about to die, but he instead just gets up and leaves. It's meant to be comedic, seemingly. Now, I for one am not a fan of this execution, though it does subvert expectations. I think it does so at the cost of undercutting the drama that the sequence has been building the last several minutes. It suggested he's sick, but it's a bit ambiguous as to what's actually going on with him, as it seems to imply he was beaten up by some of Monotoli's henchmen or even thrown from a nearby building, but I don't think that ambiguity necessarily translates to the player's perception of the moment. This is a moment we'll revisit at a later time though. Back inside again, the game requires the player to check a pretty specific spot that doesn't work if they use the L button to do so, but the game intentionally has Everdred use the check terminology to make it clear quickly what to do in such a case. Doing so causes a strange text box to open, and then the screen fades to white.